Ludmilla wanted to pinch her nose as the smell of goblin wafted through the air. Presumably, they smelled that way for the same reason that she herself avoided using perfume or picking up any other strong scents whenever she could, to prevent being detected out in the wilderness. Goblins, however, never ever seemed to wash, for fear of losing the odor they had accumulated. She could smell them from quite a distance away if she was downwind. It was not pleasant, if she were to be pleasant about it. This one had added to the already noxious odor by soiling himself. She produced a length of twine to bind the unconscious goblin's wrists in front of him, then sniffed her hands gingerly. Blesh. She would probably have the squire zombie scrubbed clean and left out to dry in the wind after this. Instructing the squire zombie to pick up their new captive, she led them to the other side of the pass and below into the trees. She tied the goblin's bindings to a tall sapling, then frowned down at him as she prodded his leg with a boot. The diminutive demi-human did not stir. "Is there some magic that will wake him up?" she asked. "None in my repertoire," Nonna answered, "though I believe that there is a spell developed in this region called Alarm that serves a related function. I thought that one just drew attention to whoever tripped it. Well, I suppose that is neither here nor there." Ludmilla reached into the infinite haversack on her right hip, withdrawing a flask. She removed the cap and poured a thin trickle of water onto the goblin's greasy scalp. Again, the demi-human showed no reaction. "Fine, be that way." She put the flask away, drawing out an enchanted one. A glob of steaming village stew spattered onto its head. "Arse!" the goblin shrieked, shaking his head violently. A trickle of stew ran down his cheek, and he abruptly stopped to start awkwardly lapping at it. "Hey, you! You're Fina! Ah!" He shot to his feet abruptly, then jerked and fell over when his tether went taut. The goblin rolled around for a bit before finally getting back onto his knees. "No dead." He squealed as he tried to get away. "No dead. No dead. No dead." Was he frightened by the presence of the undead? Ludmilla looked up at Nonna. The elder lich returned her look as if to refute her unspoken assertion. "This is obviously your doing," Nonna said as she floated down to stand beside her. Ludmilla looked back at the goblin, who continued to pant "No dead." As he attempted to break free of his bindings, she put away the enchanted flask, then stepped away from Nonna. The goblin's bloodshot eyes followed her. She took a step towards him, and he shrieked again, resuming his desperate attempts to free itself. How is he more scared of me than an elder lich? I'm not even undead, for Sursana's sake. "Look," she said, "I am not going to her." Well, no, she would hurt him if she had to. For whatever reason, the stupid goblin caught on to what she was going to say and panicked even more. The sapling quivered violently as the goblin ran this way and that, seemingly unable to comprehend that he was tied to the tree. "Stop that." The goblin stopped. "Name?" she asked, trying to look friendly. "No." The goblin stopped partway, peering at Ludmilla suspiciously. Her frown returned. "Knob." It squealed in a panic, "No dead." "All right, Knob," Ludmilla said, "where are you from?" "You?" "No, you." "No, you." She wanted to reach out and slap the thing. Instead, she tried settling herself with a deep breath, which she instantly regretted. "Where is Knob from?" Ludmilla tried again. "Knob from there." It used its chin to point south, over the pass. "How far?" "Not know." Knob's eyes widened after the words left his mouth. "No dead. No dead." It would have been much better if they had sent a hobgoblin instead. Unfortunately, time was precious now that they were starting to poke their noses north. "Does Knob's tribe live over there as well?" Knob nodded. "What about this new tribe that's appeared?" New tribe not from there." She would need to keep her words simple, but Ludmilla thought she could get what she needed out of the goblin. "So, this new tribe. Army. This little." Ludmilla cleared her throat and the goblin backed away, tripping over its tether. It fell into a panic again. Ludmilla sighed. "Knob." The goblin stopped and looked up at her again. "Where did this army come from?" "From other side, where sun goes." "Why did the army come here?" "Army big, can go where army wants." "So there is no reason why the army came here?" He stared at her blankly for a moment, then shook his head. "Knob not know. Hob take gob, to be big big? Take all." She supposed that it was what it boiled down to, which was what she already knew. Gleaning any in-depth information from a goblin was just an exercise in frustration. Her immediate priority was to figure out what their plans were, then move according to what she could discover. She examined the scrawny little demi-human, wondering how she could loosen its tongue. Even the slightest movement made him panic, but firm words seemed to grab his attention. Ludmilla withdrew another enchanted flask, this one filled with icy cold water. She took a long, refreshing draught, watching Nob out of the corner of her eye. The goblin swallowed audibly. "Is Nob thirsty?" she asked. Nob nodded. Ludmilla knelt, placing a wooden cup on a large stone and filled it halfway to the brim. The goblin eyed the cup for a long moment before moving forward. He jerked to a stop about half a meter away, once again reaching the limit of his tether. Nob shot her a betrayed look. She lifted the cup from the stone. "Does Nob know why Nob is here?" "Hobbs sent Nob." Ludmilla remained silent at the answer. Nob looked at the cup in her hand, licking his lips. "Nob go look," but Hobbs deaded Nob. "Said no go, but no. Stupid Hobbs." She leaned forward and placed the cup of water in Nob's hands. The goblin raised it to his mouth and drank in greedy swallows that sent rivulets off of his cheeks and down his neck. When he finished, he looked around before throwing the cup at the rock it had been placed on. The cup bounced off and went skittering into a bush. Ludmilla ordered the nearby squire zombie to retrieve the cup, and she filled it again. "Look where?" she asked, holding up the cup out towards the goblin. "Look where Hobbs want go?" Nob answered, looking past Ludmilla's shoulder to the north. "Nob say no, Nob say no. But Hobbs say no, so Nob go. Nob deaded, Nob not deaded?" He looked across at her hopefully. "If Nob continues to work with me," Ludmilla handed over the cup again, "I will forgive Nob just this once. Now, why does the army want to go north?" "Home, home no good. Skies turn bad. Skies turn bad. Sun always," Nob shook his head. "Water shrinks. Plants turn brown. Animals go away. Skies turn bad, no good. Tribes fight for springs, for food, then army comes. Army, belly big. Take all. Eat all. Drink all." Aside from the part about the army, everything he described sounded like it was the Sorceress Kingdom's doing. While the Connors corrected the weather in their own stretch of territory, she hadn't dispatched them to work along the rest of the southwestern border yet. The 2 months of perfect weather provided for the farmlands for the Sorceress Kingdom resulted in decidedly imperfect weather south of them. It was sunny unless Lord Mayor had it rain, and the rain was only enough for the areas where he wanted it to rain. The Katza River was 2 meters lower as a result, and she could only imagine how dry the upper reaches had become. The implications of being able to control the weather at will were both promising and terrifying at the same time. It could mean freedom from the whims of weather, providing great plenty for an entire nation, or it could ruin one by forcing drought and turning fertile fields and forests into parched wasteland. Ludmilla wasn't sure if the royal court only intended to manipulate the weather to compensate for the delayed sowing season this last spring, but, if it continued, vast swathes of the theocracy would probably be devastated. Shelving her thoughts on the matter for later, Ludmilla turned her attention back to the goblin quietly waiting for her to say something. She reached into her infinite haversack again, drawing out several strips of venison jerky. Nob's eyes latched onto them, and drool started leaking out of the corner of his mouth. "It sounds as if Nob does not like this army much," she said, handing a piece of meat over to him. "Nob was forced to come into my territory, and the army is taking everything for themselves." Nob nodded his head empathetically as he chewed on the tough strip of meat. "In that case," she smiled, "there is something I would like for Nob to do." Leaning in the shade of a withered birch tree, Zril watched a dozen goblins carry the newest shipment of supplies into his camp. Their skinny green forms glistened with sweat, and just looking at them increased his own discomfort. It was hot, damn hot. Every single day, the sun beat down on them without a single cloud in the sky, and the night brought little in the way of a reprieve. His dwarf-forged plate mail felt like that damn human chef's infernal grill, and he could only remove it when he was off duty. Damn gnolls, this basin is more like a cauldron. Well, he supposed he couldn't rightly blame them. The landscape was as they had described, and no one realized that there was some sort of drought going on at first. The weather on the western side of the pass was exactly the same, except that the river basin on the other side was much larger. A dry spell was a dry spell. It wasn't as if anyone could control the weather, so there was no one to hold responsible. Things were going slower than everyone would have liked. The local tribes were uncooperative, food was scarce, and water could only be found in the streams and rivers fed by underground springs. With so many dried conifers everywhere, he felt like they were walking into a giant pyre. General Avad shared his concerns, as did all of the other captains, so he had volunteered to lead an advance contingent north to locate greener lands. "Captain," one of his lieutenants walked up and saluted. "Scouts returned." "Really?" "Yup. Scampered in to report just now." "Bring him over here, then," Zrod told the lieutenant. "Yes, sir." The hobgoblin saluted smartly, then marched off in the direction from which he had come. Zrol honestly hadn't expected the first scout he sent off to return. The first reconnaissance forces they sent were weak goblins that hadn't been extensively trained, with the idea that they'd most likely fall prey to whatever was out there. A detachment had been left at the impressive-looking territorial marker to await its return, or observe whatever it riled up. The goblin hadn't returned for over 2 days, so he figured something got him along the way. It wasn't uncommon, and they'd have sent a real scouting force since nothing ridiculous had reared its ugly head. Every local tribe in the area had the same basic fears, that the humans to the south were too strong to fight, and the humans to the north. They couldn't even tell you anything substantial about the ones to the north. Only that they were supposedly there, and that death awaited anyone that dared to cross the markers. As the officer in charge of leading the foray north, he entertained these fears that bordered on superstition, but only to a point. Armies that fell prey to rampant, unsubstantiated rumors did not remain armies for long. The lieutenant returned with the goblin in question. It was as skinny as the rest, though it actually looked better than when it had parted with them. It was also quite a bit dirtier if that was possible. Zrol frowned at the stains that ran down its chin and chest. "Let's hear it," he said. The goblin looked up at him hesitantly, and Zrol grew impatient. He straightened to his full height, glaring down at him. "Report." "Nob back." Nob smiled up at him. The average goblin was dumb, but this one seemed especially idiotic. "Okay, now that Nob is back, what did Nob see?" "Nob see trees, bushes, rocks, stones, stone rocks." Zrol sighed as Nob listed every possible thing that he saw, noting the rocky pass and the forests on the other side. "Nob see pond and stream, water from ground." "Nob come back." "Nob see." "That's enough." Zrol held up a hand. "So there weren't any traps or anything?" "Probably not. A gob this week wouldn't have returned if he set one off." As expected, Nob shook his head. "So none of these humans you're all so scared of popped up to kill Nob?" Nob flinched at the word human, frantically looking everywhere as if one would appear upon mention. Zrol sneered at his reaction. "Pathetic." Human no kill Nob," Nob replied. But human smell everywhere." Zrol scowled down at the goblin. Was he still trying to justify his obviously non-existent fears? He exchanged a glance with the other officer, who shrugged in return. "One last question," Zrol said. "What are all those stains on the front of Nob?" There was obviously blood mixed in with the mud, but Zrol wondered if the little scamp would try and lie to his face. "Nob find rabbit. Eat. Drink good water from pond. Find bird. Eat." Nob patted his belly with a satisfied look on his face. At least he didn't lie to him. Maybe there was hope for the guy, after all. "Return him to the training camps in the back," Zrol told his lieutenant. 30 strikes with an iron rod when he gets there." Nob made a strangled sound upon hearing his punishment. "Why?" he cried. "Nob did job. Nob good Nob." "Nob did a good job," Zrol nodded, "but Nob still broke the rules. Everything scrounged up is to be brought back to the quartermaster for redistribution, can't just eat it all yourself. Tell you what, since Nob did good, we'll take 5 off the top." Zrol started walking off, then looked over his shoulder at the lieutenant. "Tie him up good and throw him on the next litter out. 25 strikes with an iron rod when he arrives, the triple give him some time to reflect on what he did." "Yes sir." The lieutenant dragged the screaming goblin away. Zrol smiled grimly to himself as he made his way through the camp. A good water source, food just out there for the taking. The path that was taken back and forth was clear of obstacles, and, judging by the goblins' time away, it couldn't be more distant than a day's march. Probably less, if he had been sneaking around and getting sidetracked. He looked up to the evening sky. The timing couldn't be more perfect. Zrul returned to his command tent, where several of his aides awaited. He looked at each before speaking. "Our canary came back," Zrul told them. "There's clean water, food, everything we need. I want 2 contingents formed, one to hold the pass, and another to set up camp on the other side. There's human territory somewhere beyond, so let's make good use of the night while we can." As night fell upon the camp, Zrul's 2 contingents, composed of 120 soldiers each, departed north towards the pass. The cool winds coming down from the rocky slopes were a refreshing change from the sweltering heat at the bottom of the dried-out valleys, and they struck a brisk march with a vanguard of goblin skirmishers running ahead of the 2 columns. With Zrul were the best of his forces, each consisting of 36 goblin skirmishers, 12 bugbear shock troops and 60 hobgoblin infantry. 6 officers presided over each column, and 6 mystics were included for support. Barring the goblins, who mostly served as expendable scouts, they were the tip of the spear, trained soldiers who had been with him since the early days of the Neck. Adorned in dwarven arms and armor, they had helped clear the haunted forest, destroying the forces of the Elder Lich that ruled one of the broken towers, then the Elder Lich itself. They had slain many monsters and subjugated hundreds of tribes throughout their long journey, and now they would be the first to cross into the north. He looked forward to raiding the sleepy human lands with them, once his other forces occupied the new camp. At a certain point, the goblins in the vanguard stopped. Zrul thought he recognized the surroundings and, sure enough, the old territorial marker stood in their path. "What are you waiting for?" he told them. "We've already checked ahead, there's nothing out there to stop us." He kicked the marker over and hurled a nearby goblin forward. Several others stared at the broken post with its scattered skulls for a long moment before resuming their advance towards the pass. Zrul snorted dismissively as he strode by, slowing the column's pace so their skirmishers could get a suitable distance ahead of the main body again. As they continued their ascent, the trees thinned out and gave way to widespread patches of windswept brush. The skies remained as clear as the day, and silvery moonlight flooded the night. This was good, as it gave them a view of the surroundings beyond the range of their dark vision, but Zrul would have preferred it to be a moonless night, or at least overcast. Humans relied entirely upon light to see, and a lightless environment would give them a decisive advantage when they started their raids. The lieutenant leading the other column angled over, a question plainly on her face. "We're packed pretty tightly here," she said, "and this pass is huge. You think we should spread ourselves out a bit? The gobs around here never shut up about how this place is a death trap. These humans might try dumping a piece of the mountain on us." Zrul looked up to the 2 peaks looming on either side of the pass. What the lieutenant said wasn't impossible, but what she had also said about the width of the passage made it difficult to pull off. It was a risk easily avoided, however. "We can go through the center instead," he told her. "Anything like that won't be able to reach us from the edges of the pass. I don't want to spread out our column any more than I need to." "You ever fought humans before?" The lieutenant shook her head, and Zrul grunted. "I've been on some modest raids against the humans of the wall in the past few years," he said, "and in a big, clear place like this, they're likely to use cavalry." "Cavalry, you mean like wolf riders?" "Hey, kinda," Zrul said. "They use horses instead." "Ah, you mean those beasts that look like centaurs without the top half?" "Yeah, those," Zrul nodded. "They're good in a sprint and pretty big, so getting caught alone can be trouble. Gobs'll get run down in droves unless they have somewhere to hide, like behind us. If we're packed tightly, we'll be able to stop any charge that they try to make, well, if they even show up." The lieutenant returned to her column, bringing it closer to his own. Over time, the uneventful ascent started to draw his suspicions. There were no walls or forts, or even any sign of patrols. Save for the faint sense of human habitation and the marker where their territory supposedly started, there was nothing. Surely someone would have noticed their procession under the light of a full moon, up a wide pass without any cover. It was a pass for crying out loud. You were supposed to defend them, or at least set watches. He idly cranked his crossbow and loaded it, just in case. Zrul gave his head a shake as more and more paranoid thoughts crept out of the shadows of his mind. Maybe he had become infected by the incessant fears of the local tribes, a disease that stoked irrational thoughts, or a curse. Ahead, it appeared that the goblins in the vanguard had stopped again. Scowling, Zril wondered if they had come across another marker. As the columns caught up with them, however, they, too, came to a halt. At the crest of the pass, a single figure stood under the streams of silver moonlight that filtered down from above. It stood about as tall as a hobgoblin, though not as broad. In one hand, it held a long spear, from which a long silken banner fluttered and snapped in the wind, a vermilion standard upon which rested an unknown emblem emblazoned in shimmering gold. Before Zrol could raise his voice and demand why it stood in their path, a clear, female voice washed over them. "You have crossed into the sovereign realm of Ein Zulgaun, the Sorcerer King," she said. "To you, who approach with arms brandished, I will ask but once, what is your business with the Sorceress Kingdom?" By the voice and scent that carried over the pass, it was a human female. Zrol remained silent, studying her carefully. Where had she appeared from? Was she a hunter from the lands beyond, belatedly tracking their goblin scout? Her equipment was inferior to the humans of the wall, and certainly far beneath Zrol's dwarven plate mail. Though her spear gleamed in the moonlight, it did not appear to be magical, nor was there any obvious sign of magical items upon her person. A single human against over 200 trained hobgoblins, bugbears, and goblins. What could she possibly do? Recalling his thoughts from before, Zril glanced from side to side, registering the details of the wide pass. There were no other humans in sight, and the field of bare stones, short grass and sparse shrubs provided no cover to conceal oneself behind. Were there traps between them? Even if there were, the goblins that they sent in first would spring them all. Based on their relative positioning, more humans might be concealed behind the top of the pass, but the odors carried on the wind were weak and did not indicate any other humans, or anything else, nearby. It didn't make any sense. What was her ploy? She mentioned the Sorceress Kingdom. Did that mean she was a magic caster? Humans were skinny compared to most other races, but she did not give the sense of being a mage or mystic. By her equipment, she was a single, lightly protected warrior standing in the middle of a very wide pass, which made for a rather ludicrous image. Did she think that she could just block them all by herself? He did not have the senses of a scout, so he only had a vague idea of her strength, but she was still clearly weaker than he. Even with what he thought should be a sizable difference, however, she still radiated a keen sense of danger that caused his much weaker goblin vanguard to cringe back. "Captain." The uncertain voice of one of his lieutenants prodded Zrol from behind. He was being needlessly hesitant in front of his subordinates. He had been through Yaldabaoth's hell and marched hundreds of kilometers to reach this point, and he would certainly not be turning back. They were headed north, whether these humans liked it or not. The lone female before them was clearly challenging their advance, and there was only one answer for such heedless fools. He raised his crossbow and pulled the trigger. The heavy wooden bolt streaked out towards its target. A hand's breadth from the center of her torso, the projectile stopped in midair. Protection from arrows? Zril frowned. I guess this human's a magic caster, after all. The bolt remained suspended in front of her for a second before clattering to the stones. "I see," she said. Fiery light glinted off of the human's eyes. A flash filled the pass, and an explosion rocked the column somewhere behind. Zrol threw himself forward as dancing shadows were cast over the barren slope. Cries of panic and pain filled the air. He looked back up to see the human still standing there, dispassionately gazing right past him as the angry hues of flickering flames played over her face. Zril rose to his feet, turning around to see what had happened to his soldiers. A line had been blasted through the back of the column, and scores of dead lay scattered and scorched over the stones. Shouts and screams continued to issue from the rear, but Zrol couldn't see anything through the curtain of thick smoke from the dried grass and shrubs that were set aflame. He ran around to the side, trying to get a view of what was going on. Orbs of flame streaked down from behind the smoke, blasting another series of holes into the column. Screaming goblins were incinerated, while hobgoblins and bugbears fell back from the blaze. They were being attacked from behind, but how did their enemies get there? It looked like magic casters of some sort were hitting them, so probably invisibility or the like. "Shield a wall," he shouted, "harden yourselves against magic. The rest of you, spread out." Zrol's corps of well-trained veterans assumed stances that raised their resistance against magic. His officers repeated his orders, and the hobgoblin infantry formed up into shield walls that would block any more incoming fireballs. Everyone else started to scatter to avoid becoming ideal targets for further bombardment. The moans of horrifically burned soldiers were joined by the dull, metallic tread of heavy boots, reverberating off of the slopes of the pass. An unsettling wave of intangible dread washed over him. Through the wall of billowing smoke, a figure emerged, encased in wicked, spiked armor. Crimson lines that traced over its dark form like pulsing veins glowed through the haze. From behind the huge tower shield that covered most of its body, a weapon flashed out, cleaving through a half-dozen goblins who were still reacting to the orders being shouted out. Zrol blanked out for a moment as his gaze followed its sudden appearance. What the hell is that thing? It was far more intimidating than the single human female blocking the pass. Chaos erupted as it charged into their ranks, crushing slow goblins underfoot while striking down others with an undulating blade of unreasonable length in one hand. Crossbow bolts splintered against its armor, and even javelins glanced off to no effect. Though it was not much larger than a bugbear, and shorter than an ogre, it seemed an inexorable juggernaut as it plowed a bloody furrow through the shattered goblin ranks. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw another dark figure emerge from the smoke. So this was it, then. This was the answer to all of his rising questions that culminated in the appearance of the human at the top of the pass. He had to admire how well the ambush had been executed. A single human had stopped their entire column, which had absolutely no need to stop in the first place, allowing the unseen magic casters to disorder their rear with area effect spells. They hit them with magic again just to shift them into a more vulnerable stance before sending these strong troops through the smoke and into the fray. But that was where it would end. They had a practically limitless pool of goblins to replace their losses from, and the elites of Zrol's unit were too well trained to be overwhelmed with just this. Now that battle was joined, he was confident that hard-earned discipline would carry them to victory. Tighten it up. Zrol's voice rose over the din of violence. Defensive stances. Pin that thing down. Unlike the goblins, who were already caught up in a panicked retreat around the advancing enemy to disappear into the smoke, his hobgoblins remained stalwart. As they tightened into a densely packed defensive formation, Zrol stepped closer, keen to discover the true mettle of this new enemy. It smashed into the line like a savage beast clad in gleaming black plate. The wall of dwarven steel was pushed back slightly, but did not buckle. Bugbears. Zrol clenched his fist in anticipation as the dozen bugbears waiting behind the defensive line came around to assail their opponent from both sides. Judging from its charge into the hobgoblin defenders, it appeared to be a bit stronger than elite hobgoblin officers like himself. The bugbears would be able to overwhelm it with brute force. To its credit, their enemy caught the first three massive war mauls descending towards it with its shield, then parried two others with its blade. Brutal blows rained down on its helmet and shoulders, and Zrol allowed himself a satisfied smirk. No matter how hard its armor might be, whoever was inside would still suffer grievous damage from the merciless hammering. He relaxed slightly as he awaited the inevitable result. And then he waited some more. After nearly a minute, the smirk slid off of Zrol's face. The rise and fall of the bugbear's war mauls slowed, then stopped. Half of his shock troops could no longer be seen, and the remainder eventually sunk out of sight in front of the shield wall. With barely a pause, the enemy warrior let out a bestial howl and reared back before slamming its massive shield into the line. Clang! 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 The air seemed to shudder with every strike, and the formation was pushed back, step by step. The defenders were stacked 4 deep, yet it continued driving forward in its relentless assault. How could it continue? The toll of its exertions should be visible by now, yet it ignored mace and hammer, axe and spear, its armor unyielding before any and all attempts to injure it by the other formations that closed in on its flanks. Zrol came forward, hefting his warhammer. He was a good deal stronger than his soldiers. He could settle his side of the fight by breaking this ridiculous stalemate. As he approached, the unsettling feeling in the air grew, though it had nothing to do with their enemy's looming figure. There were plenty of bugbears in the army that were around the same size, and a number of ogres had been recruited as well. He finally realized just what that feeling was when he came close enough to recognize the features that could be seen from between the gaps in its helmet. Twin points of crimson flared from within, reflecting off of the inside of its armor and casting lurid light over its ruined features. What it used to be, he could not tell, but it could only be one thing now. Undead. These damned humans. His realization unraveled the mystery of their opponent's unlimited stamina, but how did the humans manage to bind such a powerful undead creature to their will? Why hadn't the officers reported this? Perhaps their dauntless mindset gave them the resolve to face down whatever their enemy might be. Close in. He barked out over the bang and screech of metal, "It's not as strong as it is tough. Seal its movements and get to work. As long as you hit an exposed piece of it, it'll take a bit of damage." Spurred by his orders, the flanking formations pressed in to carry out his commands. The undead monstrosity ground to a halt, eventually becoming so restricted that it resorted to bashing the shields in front of it with short, overhand blows. Zrol looked over to the other side of the battle, where the officers were imitating his maneuver with the one on their end. Now that the situation was under control, they could chip these undead warriors down until the dark energies fueling their unnatural forms were depleted. His ears pricked up at a new sound, and his eyes widened when he recognized the rhythmic steps. "Damn it! More enemies," he shouted, coming from the back. Metallic stomping filled the air, and two more of the undead warriors broke through the curtain of black smoke. To Zrol's mounting horror, the mutilated remains of his rearguard emerged in their wake, surging forward in a wave of undeath. Standing out to the side of the ongoing battle, Ludmilla rolled the banner of the Sorceress Kingdom up around the spear it was attached to before putting it away. As with nearly everyone, she had heard the tales of brave bannermen and inspiring female knights charging into battle with flags attached to their spears and lances. But, after trying to practice fighting in such a fashion, she decided that it was too unwieldy in practice. Doing so would also result in the nation's banner being shredded to tatters, so, even symbolically, it seemed like a bad idea in general. Instead, she retrieved her longbow and knocked it with an envenomed steel bodkin arrow, just in case her intervention was required for something. She would otherwise refrain from participating directly in combat, instead observing and learning as much as she could of both her enemies and the undead servitors at her disposal. Several concepts and ideas were being proven or disproven as things progressed, and there were a few that went beyond her expectations or ability to comprehend from simple descriptions. After securing Nob's cooperation, Ludmilla led him to the other side of the pass and the nearest spring so he could report his discovery of a new campsite in suitable detail upon his return. She then found a rabbit and a duck for him to devour, hoping his messy eating habits would conceal any traces of their interaction. After he set off, she sent one of the two shadow demons guarding her to retrieve the three elder liches back in the Vale, along with the remaining bone vultures on standby. She sent the other to bring additional 2 death knights from the 2 nearest passes to where she would craft her ambush. The bone vultures set to watch over the camp reported a flurry of activity shortly after Nob entered. As she had hoped, the hobgoblins enacted the usual routines that had been observed throughout their spread into the basin, sending a small contingent of soldiers to secure the location for the next encampment after receiving a favorable report. Ludmilla and Nonna, cloaked in invisibility, followed them from high above, returning to the top of the pass to make their final preparations once she believed she had sufficient information on the approaching intruders. The ambush was about as simple as she thought would suit her purposes. A pair of Death Knights and Elder Liches would quietly wait on each side using invisibility to conceal themselves, and Ludmilla would stand at the top of the pass. She figured the hobgoblins wouldn't take too long to make up their minds and attack her, but she still ended up having enough time to ask them what they were up to. She cringed internally even as she played her part in the scheme, and thinking about how silly she must have looked up there progressively made it worse in retrospect. They didn't even answer her properly in the end, and her verbal response to that felt even more lacking. "I see," she thought derisively. "I should be thankful some bard wasn't out there to relate how utterly uninspiring I was to all and sundry." The 2 shadow demons accompanied her when she stood before the columns, just in case they all tried charging her at once. Nonna's protection from arrows enchantment was the only thing she required, however, as the largest hobgoblin in the group casually brought up his crossbow and loosed a bolt at her. Gaining full justification to retaliate, she set the awaiting undead to work. The first set of fireball spells cut off the rear quarter of the columns, setting the dry grass and shrubs nearby aflame. The 4 Death Knights advanced while cloaked in their invisibility. The spell did not block sound, but, With the chaos suddenly erupting before them, the goblins, who looked to be carrying supplies, were probably taken by surprise when the undead warriors attacked out of their concealment. When a suitable line of squire zombies was raised, Nonna signaled her by laying down another line of fireball spells with the other elder liches. Ludmilla ordered 2 of the Death Knights forward, having them leave their squire zombies behind to catch anyone trying to flee back down the pass. It was then she finally had her first real look at how the stalwart sentries that tirelessly watched over Rantel and its duchy carried themselves in battle. Most notably, at least to her, was not a Death Knight's durability or limitless endurance, but its skill that drew the attention of those around it. According to Nonna, any individual affected by its unsettling presence could be subjected to an effect similar to the martial arts commonly used by warriors to force the attention of an adversary upon themselves. She wondered if the hobgoblins even realized what was happening to them. All attention in the goblinoid column turned to one of the 2 Death Knights that charged through the veil of smoke, and Ludmilla was able to blithely stroll over from the top of the pass to where she currently stood without anyone paying any attention to her whatsoever. She noted that the skill did not provoke those affected into attacking it single-mindedly, and the commands barked out by the hobgoblin officers that involved fighting against the Death Knight were still effective in directing their subordinates. She wasn't sure if anyone so affected could willfully shake free from the Death Knight's skill, but the goblins that succumbed to their fear appeared to be able to at least flee. They were either slain by the 2 Death Knights waiting for them on the other side of the screen of smoke, incapacitated by sleep and spells of holding, or otherwise collected by the squire zombies and bone vultures that worked together to keep any enemies from returning down into the basin. From her position, she watched the 2 separate battles play out on either side of the burning line of vegetation. On the south end, the fighting was dying down, with bone vultures occasionally swooping down to knock over loose goblins still trying to flee. Squire zombies would then drag them back to the awaiting Death Knights to be sorted out. On the north end, the fighting had settled into an odd sort of stalemate, with formations of hobgoblins working together to pin down and restrain the 2 Death Knights there. The Death Knight's tremendous durability was made plain to see, but, at the same time, Ludmilla worried that they might be closer to expiring than their unflinching behavior let on. Undead fought tirelessly until they perished, with no in-betweens unless they started losing pieces of themselves. Nonna separated herself from the other elder liches, flying over to settle down beside her. "Tell me nothing got away," Ludmilla said. "Nothing got away," Nonna replied. "Did nothing get away?" Ludmilla frowned. "Based on your assessment of the enemy force before the battle," Nonna said, "none present are high enough in levels to escape notice by the bone vultures in this terrain. You requested that I report to you when things died down." Ludmilla nodded silently, then gestured to the hobgoblins still fighting their battle. Their formations remained intact as they continued to chip away at the Death Knight. "Do you understand what's going on there?" she asked the elder lich. Nonna peered down at the blob of hobgoblins surrounding the Death Knight. "There is no precedent for this," Nonna said after several moments. "The goblinoids native to this region have not displayed the same degree of resilience as these. These ones are not from around here, as you well know. Not only are they incredibly well trained, but these hobgoblins' disciplined reaction to the Death Knights suggests that they are blooded and experienced combatants. I do not know if they have raided someplace or are being supplied somehow, but their equipment is exquisitely crafted." Hobgoblins were about as tall as humans, but their proportions were different. Judging by the uniform quality and look of the hobgoblins' arms and armor, it was more likely that they were being supplied. That was, of course, unless their raiding had come up with an impressive amount of conveniently hobgoblin and bugbear-sized equipment somehow. Shouts echoed up the sides of the pass, and a surge of activity rose from the hobgoblin formations. They pressed in ever more tightly, and the Death Knight was caught with its shield arm trapped against its side. It still worked its flambeau in a continued attempt to batter its enemies, but its range of motion was severely restricted. Seeing that the enemy commander had fully committed to the effort to destroy the Death Knights, Ludmilla ordered the rest of her ground forces through the smoke, focusing their strength on the nearest group. Due to the beleaguered Death Knight's continued use of its skill, the hobgoblins couldn't even turn to face the incoming threat. The 2 fresh Death Knights charged, well ahead of the much slower squire zombies, and upended the first few hobgoblins that they smashed into from the rear. After a dozen seconds of the Death Knights working their way through the ranks to their trapped comrade, the Squire zombies caught up and washed over the formation. Attention still caught by the first Death Knight, the hobgoblins didn't even react to defend themselves when the Squire zombies set upon them. The encirclement of hobgoblins buckled on one side, then broke. Not 100 meters away, the second encirclement didn't even spare them a glance. That skill is ridiculous, Ludmilla frowned. There must be limits. The conditions are quite clear, Nonna told her. Those that are mentally shaken by the Death Knight are affected by the skill. I understand that, Ludmilla said, but what about the range? You couldn't just send one of these across the wilderness and have it attract a long line of all the demi-humans that it runs by between here and Roblé, could you? Nonna turned her head and stared at her for a moment. Was that an attempt at humor? The elder lich asked. No, I was perfectly serious, Ludmilla answered. The conditions you have described are so broad that too many things can potentially work. The way that the Death Knights forced the hobgoblin formations to focus their attention on it had implications that threw much of the knowledge Ludmilla had gained about maneuvering formations and employing various tactics straight out the window. Even this ambush had been calculated and timed based on the weaknesses and traits she could exploit, yet all of that was effectively for naught since the Death Knight could make an army vulnerable to flanking attacks by turning the army's attention to itself. These hobgoblins were clearly well-trained and disciplined soldiers, yet all their experience and effort had been cast to the wind by the Death Knight using a single skill. If this happened to anyone, all they could do was hope they could defeat it before some other force was brought to bear against them. The skill has a radius of roughly 30 meters, Nonna told her. It works only on shaken individuals, so it is not as ridiculous as you suggest. If other members of the Sorceress Kingdom's armies were to work together with Death Knights, Ludmilla said, how would I prevent them from being affected? Our allies have nothing to fear from them, so they should not have the shaken status. Status? She furrowed her brow at the unfamiliar term. Indeed. Much like being diseased, poisoned, feared or charmed, shaken is a specific status. What if they are shaken by events that they have witnessed on the battlefield? The status must originate from the Death Knight or come from the results of its actions. Then it can still happen, Ludmilla said, even if unintended. Is there some way to prevent it entirely? Spells that provide emotional stability or harden one against fear-type effects would work, Nonna told her. Certain beings lack emotions entirely, such as the golems currently in your employ, so they are similarly immune. Undead are also immune, as they are generally immune to mind-affecting effects and abilities. Also, the feared status overrides shaken, those so affected will enjoy a sort of immunity as well. In short, the skill was still something that could turn the tide of battle in a small area if one's opponents did not prepare countermeasures. A thought occurred to her, and Ludmilla pulled off a gauntlet, holding up her ring of mental fortitude. My ring is not glowing, she said. You do not fear Death Knights in the first place. I suppose, but that means that anyone that can overcome their trepidation over the Death Knight is immune to this skill. Correct. While it was not impossible, it was probably easier said than done. Most people directly subjected to the aggression of a Death Knight wouldn't be able to shrug off their initial reaction so easily. Exploiting the mental state of her opponents in combat was something Ludmilla was well versed in, so she believed she could put the Death Knights and their powerful skill to good use in the future. The noise from the first set of hobgoblin formations gradually faded. After sending her undead forces to the other encirclement, where the other Death Knight appeared to be no worse for wear than before, Ludmilla came forward to examine the aftermath more closely. Most of the hobgoblins had been transformed into the undead, though many corpses lay on the ground for some reason. There were many charred goblins near to where the fireballs fell, so those had been most likely slain by the elder liches, but all of the bugbears had not been reanimated. She could not recall anything special about them that might result in being immune to being raised as a squire zombie. Looking down more closely at the bodies, her speculation over the origin of the invaders' equipment appeared to be validated. They fit too well to not have been crafted for at least bugbears and hobgoblins in general, and they did not follow the style of any human equipment that she knew of. The armor was thick, angular and almost blocky in appearance. It had not been polished to a bright finish like humans tended to do, instead dull, unreflective and probably treated to give it a dark grey color. Was it possible that these hobgoblins had crafted their own equipment? The demi-humans that dwelled in the Abelian wilderness were reportedly composed of primitive tribal groups, with nothing resembling the civilizations of other demi-human nations out in the wider world. She looked over at the next corpse and realized it was the large hobgoblin who had attacked her with its crossbow at the beginning of the battle. Her head snapped up, and she ran over to the other group of hobgoblins who were in the process of being overwhelmed. Scanning the milling mass of bodies, she tried to sort through the demi-humans that remained. Leave those 3 alive. Subdue them and drag them out of that mess. The orders would have been woefully insufficient if she was issuing them to humans, but the undead servitors appeared to understand her perfectly. The 3 hobgoblins she had in mind were dragged out and forced to the ground. Since the opening attack of the battle, a mere 15 minutes had passed, resulting in 237 dead goblinoids, most repurposed into undead servitors, and 3 prisoners. Ludmilla fervently hoped that one of them possessed some useful information.